So now that we have talked about what the neurons and the glial cells of the nervous system, and we've talked about how they work, we've talked about the action potential, we've talked about synaptic transmission. So we've really gotten to how the nervous system works all the way down at the cellular and molecular level. Now we're going to zoom out and talk about the structure of the nervous system. Basically, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord and other parts of the nervous system in a little more detail. Before we do that, though, we should talk about some general anatomical terms that are going to come up. These are anatomical references that apply to all parts of the body, but they're especially useful when we're talking about the nervous system. So first of all animals have three body axes. So these are just directions that we assigned to different parts of the body in relationship to each other. So for animals that walk around on all fours, or what we call quadrupeds, they have a front end called the anterior and a back end called the posterior. And so that line from the anterior end to the posterior end we call the anterior posterior axis. Sometimes the anterior end is also called the rostral end. Rostral means towards the nose, because the word rostrum means the nose, or just kind of the front of the face. And then caudal to refer to the other end of the body, because it comes from the Latin word for tail. So it's the direction toward the tail of the body. And then there's, and again, that axis is true whether you're looking from the side or from the top. There's then the dorsal ventral axis. So the dorsal side of the body is usually the top, the point, the direction pointing up when the animal is standing on the ground. And then ventral is towards the ground usually, or towards the belly. And so for animals, the brain is at the anterior end, and then the spinal cord attaches to the posterior end of the brain, and then it goes down to the posterior, down the length of the posterior body. And then you can see there's one more axis, and that's the direction from side to side. However, because we are, most animals, at least vertebrates, have bilateral symmetry. That means they have a line down the middle that divides the body into two equal halves. We call that the midline. And so anything close to that midline we say is medial. And then as you get further away from that midline, you're going lateral. So we call this the medial lateral axis. And that's the difference between the medial lateral axis and the other two, is that it has a center, whereas the other two really don't. There's no defined midpoint between, say, dorsal and ventral, or between anterior and posterior. But with the lateral medial axis, this midline is the middle, so there's another medial lateral axis on the other side, on the left side. Another term that or a pair of terms that come up, especially when you're referencing two different body parts or parts of the same organ. If you're referring to two different things that are on opposite sides of that midline, we say they are contralateral. So the left front paw is contralateral to the right front paw, and so on. And meanwhile, if you want to reference two things that are on the same side of the body, we say they are ipsilateral. So the left front foot is ipsilateral to the left hind foot, and so on. And so again, those are just sort of common anatomical axes to help us keep track of where we are in the body and in the brain. Now with humans, you have to use slightly different nomenclature, because we are one of actually very few animals that walk on two legs. So most animals walk on four legs or no legs, and humans, and really the only other living animals that routinely walk on their hind legs are birds. But we walk on our back legs, but we still have the same body axes. But essentially, because we walk on our hind legs, you can think of those body axes as being rotated 90 degrees. So if you're comparing a human to a dog, for example, so again, this would be the dorsal ventral axis of the dog. So this is dorsal going up, and then ventral going down. For humans, essentially it's rotated. So this direction is dorsal, so toward your back, and this direction is ventral, toward your stomach, or toward your belly. And that's true of the anterior posterior axis as well. So again, in the dog, just like in the rat, this direction would be posterior or caudal, and this direction would be anterior or rostral. And in humans, generally along the body, this direction is anterior and this direction is posterior. So toward your head is anterior, toward your rear end is posterior. But in the brain or in the head, we rotate those axes because essentially your head is rotated forward 90 degrees with respect to your body. Or if you prefer to think of it, when again we descended from animals that walked on four legs, so when we went from being quadrupedal to being bipedal, our body axis rotated 90 degrees. So instead of being parallel to the ground, it's now perpendicular to the ground, but our head axis did not turn. So your head axis is still essentially horizontal with respect to the ground, which means it's the same as in other quadrupedal animals. So the head axes kind of rotate 90 degrees to the body axes if you are a human or, again, another animal that walks on four legs. So in the brain, we say that this direction is dorsal, so towards the top of the head, whereas this direction is ventral, towards the bottom. And then the rostrocaudal and anterior posterior axes also are rotated. So in the brain, forward is anterior, towards your face, and posterior towards the back of your head is that direction. And then the rostrocaudal too. Rostral again sort of means towards your nose. Caudal means towards your tail. So again, that one kind of rotates as well as the other ones. Whereas if we're talking about, say, the spinal cord, then this direction is dorsal and this direction is ventral. Also with humans and sometimes in other animals, we use the terms superior and inferior. Often this axis doesn't change, so superior pretty much always means above and inferior means below. So that's true even if you're in the head or the body. One thing to point out is that these are all relative terms. So when I say that the brain, for example, is superior to the spinal cord, that just means it's above the spinal cord. But at the same time, within the brain, we could say that, for example, the cerebral cortex, which is this whole area here, is superior to, say, the cerebellum because it's above that. So again, these are all relative terms, so it's always one thing relative to something else. So in addition to the anatomical axes, we can talk about several planes of section. And so especially in the nervous system, but this is true of pretty much any body part, oftentimes you can learn a lot about it by looking on the inside of the organ, and that's true of the brain. So a lot of pictures you'll see of the brain or the spinal cord will be of sectioned pieces of tissue. So that means that someone has taken the brain and cut it into pieces so that you can see the cross section. Now, of course, you can cut a brain or any tissue in any direction you want, but there are, by convention, just so you can easily compare two different sections, say, that were taken of different brains by different people, then we use these same three planes of section pretty much every time. So you'll always see those directions. So again, for the brain in a human, there are three planes. One is essentially parallel to the ground, and it's also then perpendicular to the anterior, it's perpendicular to the dorsal ventral axis. So remember, up toward the top of the head is dorsal, down is ventral. So when we say that this plane is perpendicular to that axis, that's what we mean. The line that we could draw through the dorsal ventral axis would go like this. And so this line is perpendicular to this plane. And that plane is called the horizontal section because, again, it's parallel to the ground, or another way to think of it is that it's parallel to the horizon. That's why it's called that. Meanwhile, there's an axis, there's a plane of section that's perpendicular to the anterior posterior axis. So this is the anterior posterior axis. And so this plane here is perpendicular to that axis. So that plane is called the coronal section. So this is the coronal section, and sometimes it's called the frontal section, but it just cuts through or perpendicular to that anterior posterior axis. And it's called coronal because I think it sort of, if you were to draw a line sort of around the outside of this section, it sort of surrounds the head like a corona. And so the corona actually is just the Latin word for crown. And you can think of like the corona around the sun, for example, if you see an eclipse. That's where that name comes from. And then there's a plane of section, of course, that goes perpendicular to the medial-lateral axis. And so this is that plane, and the medial-lateral axis is kind of coming out of the screen toward us here. And so this section is called the sagittal section. And in this particular one, it's called mid-sagittal. Sometimes the word medial is used too. This is the mid-sagittal section because it cuts right down the center. So it's right through the midline of the brain. But you could have a sagittal section that is not straight down the middle, and that would be a parasagittal section. But in any case, it's still perpendicular to that medial-lateral axis. And so these are the axes for the planes of section for the brain, and they're actually the same for both humans and rats. So over here is a picture of a rat brain. Again, this is the sagittal, or in this case, mid-sagittal section of through a rat brain. In this case, it's cutting it into mirror image left and right halves, but you could also have a section that's off-center, and that would be a parasagittal section. And then this section here, where again the plane is parallel to the ground and perpendicular to the dorsal ventral axis, is called the horizontal section in the rat, just like it is in the human. And same thing with the coronal section. It's perpendicular to the anterior posterior axis. Now, the only thing that really differs actually with the human versus the rat brain, or the human brain versus other quadruped brains, is when you get out of the brain and into, say, the spinal cord. So down here is the spinal cord, and you can see in a rat, the planes of section for the spinal cord are exactly the same as they are in the brain. So a coronal section in the brain would be the exact same thing as a coronal section through the spinal cord. So if we were to try to draw that, it would be something like this. So that would be a coronal section through the spinal cord, and it would cut it into front and back parts. Meanwhile, in the human spinal cord, because again that brain axis kind of turns corners here, change colors, are what's called the neuroaxis, just the line that you can draw through the brain and spinal cord, rotates 90 degrees in humans compared to what it does in the rat. These axes through the spinal cord are rotated. So again, the dorsal and ventral sides of the spinal cord do not correspond to the dorsal and ventral sides of the brain. So this section right here that cuts through the spinal cord, this is how it's usually depicted. You can make it cut like this. You can cut the spinal cord horizontally. You can cut the spinal cord sagittally, but typically when you see the spinal cord, it's cut in this view, which corresponds to the coronal section actually. So it's even though in reality, if you position the brain and spinal cord together, the coronal section through the spinal cord and the coronal section through the brain are 90 degrees to each other, this would still be basically a coronal section of the spinal cord, or again, you might see it called the frontal section. So it's a bit confusing because again, it looks like this should be, because it's parallel to the horizontal section, we would call it a horizontal section of the spinal cord, but that's not what it is. So anyway, when you see these pictures, when you see pictures of the brain, it's useful to know these axes and know these planes, because the point of the section is to show you what the inside of the brain looks like, but you need to be able to tell how those different parts or what part of the brain you're actually seeing whenever you're looking at one of these sections. Now, there are a whole bunch of different terms that we use to describe different types of brain tissue. We've talked about some of these already. So if you cut open a piece of brain, and of course this, as you should know now, is a coronal section through the brain. So we're looking through part of the brain where the top part is dorsal, bottom part is ventral, and then there's a midline down the middle, cutting it into medial and lateral parts. But the different regions here have different shading, because different parts of brain tissue kind of have different densities, different amounts of lipids and things, and so parts of the brain tissue are darker when you look at a properly dissected piece of brain than others. So we call those regions gray matter. Now, it's not actually gray. It's more of a kind of a pink or brownish color. And then white matter, which is not really white, but it's much lighter in coloration than the gray matter. And that's just where the two terms come from. So the things that make those two types of tissue different are that the gray matter contains the cell bodies of the neurons. So neurons in the brain, their cell bodies, and most of their dendrites are also in that gray matter. Whereas in white matter, it consists mostly of axons, and especially the myelin surrounding those axons. In fact, it's the myelin that makes it white, because myelin, if you remember, is mostly just many layers of cell membrane, which means it's essentially like fat, and there's very little water. And so that's why white matter has that appearance. But really, it's just many bundles of axons surrounded by myelin, which means that the white matter is the parts of the brain that connect different parts of the brain with each other and connect the brain with other parts of the nervous system, like the spinal cord. And then the outer layer of what we call the forebrain, or sometimes called the cerebrum, is called the cerebral cortex. The word cortex just means covering. So in fact, there's other kinds of cortex. There's a different part of the brain called the cerebellum. It has its own outer layer that we call the cerebellar cortex. Other organs, like the adrenal gland, has an outer layer that's called the adrenal cortex. So that's all the word cortex means. But in the brain, it just refers to the outermost surface of the brain, at least the forebrain. And as you can see, the outermost layers are mostly gray matter. It's the same kind of tissue as the deeper parts of gray matter, which means that there's mostly cell bodies in there. And as we'll see later, the neurons in the cerebral cortex and other cortical regions of the brain have a distinct layered structure to them. So that's why that's where those names come from. Which means, of course, that the white matter next to the cortex consists of axons taking information away from the cortex or bringing information back. Some other kind of structural terms that'll show up. So gray matter, again, all it means is that there's lots of neurons there. So there's different names for different types of gray matter, or there are different anatomical terms that'll show up. Sometimes the word nucleus is used to refer to a group of neurons in the brain, which is kind of confusing because, of course, the word nucleus also means the part of a cell that has the chromosomes in it. But in the nervous system, or at least in the brain, we use the term nucleus to describe any group of neurons that are sort of where their cell bodies are close together and they have common inputs and outputs. And then other terms that refer to regions of gray matter, the word substantia sometimes is used, where you have a group of neurons that maybe aren't quite clustered together tightly enough to be called a nucleus, but still have enough things in common that they need a common name. The word locus, which just means location or spot, sometimes will show up. So these are all just different terms for certain regions of the brain, and we'll see them, or we'll encounter them more later. Meanwhile, in the peripheral nervous system, it's worth pointing out, a group of cell bodies, neuron cell bodies that are bundled together, we call a ganglion. And now, strictly speaking, I have this listed under gray matter. We don't really say that there's gray matter in the peripheral nervous system, but the word ganglion and the word nucleus are kind of correspond to each other. So a nucleus is a group of neurons in the brain. A ganglion is just a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Meanwhile, for white matter, there's all kinds of terms to refer to different regions of white matter. So words like tract, capsule, bundle, lemniscus, these are all just names for groups of axons that tend to go to and from the same location together. and so they get anatomical terms. The word commissure is kind of special because it refers specifically to axons or groups of axons that cross from one side of the brain to the other. And then when we talk about a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, we use the word nerve. Again, we don't really say that the nerve or the white matter exists in the peripheral nervous system, but the word nerve is the closest thing we have in the peripheral nervous system. And of course, a nerve consists of axons that could be either taking information away from the brain and spinal cord or to, depending on the type of axon. And we'll talk about examples of those later on. So of course, and we've already said that the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is really everything else. So it's all the nerves coming out of either the spinal cord, which we call spinal nerves, or coming out of the brain, which we call cranial nerves. And then there are various sensory ganglia that are part of the sensory systems, and what are called autonomic ganglia. So these are neurons that are part of the autonomic nervous system, which we will talk about later. Now, if we just look at the brain, there are different ways of dividing up the brain and classifying different parts of the brain, depending on kind of who you're asking. The word cerebrum technically refers to really the forebrain, the front of the brain. So it includes the region here, which we'll talk about, the cerebral cortex and some of that underlying tissue. Sometimes, though, the word cerebrum and the word brain are used interchangeably because the cerebrum, at least, is the part of the brain you can see without cutting it open. So sometimes when you just look for search for the word cerebrum, you'll just get pictures of brains. So sometimes you'll see those words used in place of each other. And then the brain stem, which actually is kind of pointing to the wrong thing here. This like pink area here is really the brain stem. And in a way, the brain stem is just kind of everything underneath the cerebrum. So all the stuff underneath the cerebral cortex and then connecting eventually to the spinal cord. The only other major division that we can really identify, at least without either cutting open the brain or doing specialized visualization techniques, is this structure that sits kind of at the base of the brain called the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum, again, kind of sits underneath the posterior part of the cerebral cortex, but in reality, if you cut it in half, you can see that it's connected directly to the brainstem, so it kind of sits on top of the brainstem. And we'll learn about it later, but it's the other major sort of external feature of at least the human brain. And then, like I said already, the brain stem eventually connects to the spinal cord, and we'll see there's not necessarily a clear distinction between where the brain stem ends and the spinal cord begins, but the spinal cord extends all the way down, or actually about halfway down the length of the body, at least in humans. So we'll talk about it in more detail later. Now, of course, this is looking at the different regions of the human brain. The same regions you'll find in other vertebrate brains. So again, here's a rat brain. So the cerebrum is just the part you can see from the outside, but it really consists of the cerebral cortex plus some underlying structures, including this big bulbous thing here called the olfactory bulb. Humans have one of these too. It's just much, much smaller proportionally in the human brain. And we'll talk about that too, how the human brain does differ from rat brains and other vertebrate brains. However, it's important to point out that right now that everything in the human brain you can find in the rat brain and vice versa. The only difference is the proportion in size. So obviously the human brain is much bigger, and parts of the human brain are proportionally much bigger than the rat brain and vice versa. So again, the cerebrum in the rat brain is maybe only about 50% or so of the total brain volume, whereas if you look in the human brain, the cerebrum takes up a much larger percentage, probably more like 60 to 70%. And then again, if you cut open the rat brain, here's a mid-sagittal view of the rat brain, you can see the brainstem actually takes up another almost 50% of the brain, with the cerebellum sitting on top of it, and then everything connects to the brainstem. The other thing you can see by looking from the top of either the rat brain or the human brain is that the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. And so each one gets a name. We call this the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. Same is true of the human brain. So obviously this is the right cerebral hemisphere of the human brain, and this is the left cerebral hemisphere of the human brain. Now, it's important to point out that the entire brain is not divided into hemispheres. Only the cerebrum is divided into hemispheres. The brainstem and as you can see, the cerebellum, for the most part, do not have. There is a midline, and there is symmetry around that midline, but there's no fissure. This structure here in the middle, which we'll learn about later, is just called the central fissure, and it divides the left and right cerebral hemispheres from each other, but it does not go all the way through the brain. And we'll see that in more detail later on. Now, before we get into more general structures, it's worth spending some time talking about the cerebral cortex. Again, the cerebral cortex is by far the biggest part of the human brain, and in fact, it's really the biggest part of all mammal brains, for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But what makes the cerebral cortex different from every other part of the brain is what it's called its cytoarchitecture. And that just means, the word cyto means cell, and architecture means architecture, so or the way it's organized. So the cytoarchitecture of the cerebral cortex looks like this. The entire thing, all the neurons are arranged in very discrete layers. Now, the number of layers is generally constant within a species. And in fact, within mammals, all mammals have a cerebral cortex with 6 distinct cell layers. But if you look in, say, reptile brains like alligators, there's only really 2 or 3 distinct layers. But the neurons in those layers are very well organized. There's always an outer layer of the cortex, no matter what species you're looking at, called the molecular layer. This layer contains no neurons, so there are no neuron cell bodies in the molecular layer. And there are, however, dendrites, so a lot of connections between neurons are found within that molecular layer. And then the outermost layer also is called layer 1. So we number the layers from outermost to innermost. So outermost is 1 for mammals. Again, innermost is 6. And usually you'll see them with those Roman numerals to indicate which layer you're in. Another distinctive feature of the cerebral cortex are these big, giant neurons called pyramidal cells. So pyramidal cells are called that, I think, mostly because of their shape. But what's interesting is that they have this very distinctive dendritic arbor, where you have several basal dendrites that sort of radiate out from the cell body and sort of fan out into the same layer, maybe 1 or 2 layers above, but then one apical dendrite that goes up away from the cell body and can branch along the way, but eventually innervates or branches out into the molecular layer. So again, neurons from other regions of cortex or other layers may connect with these apical dendrites out here in this molecular layer. So again, those pyramidal neurons are unique to the cerebral cortex. They're not found in any other part of the brain. And we can classify different parts of cerebral cortex, and there's generally at least 2 major divisions. The paleocortex consists mostly of 2 regions: the olfactory cortex, which in the rat brain is down here on the ventral side, so olfactory cortex down here, and then this fold underneath the other layer is called the hippocampus. So this is the hippocampus of a rat brain, and it looks like it's not really on the outer surface, but in fact, the reason it looks that way is because the hippocampus kind of folds up underneath the other layers. So in fact, that's why you can see this sort of empty space in between the hippocampus and the rest of the brainstem, because again, it sort of is folded underneath there. The word hippocampus, by the way, hippo comes from the Greek word for horse, and campus from the Greek word for the sea. And in fact, the word hippocampus means seahorse, because I guess someone, either in a human or another animal, dissected it and decided that the way it kind of curls up looks like a seahorse's tail, I guess. In any case, those 2 together we call paleocortex, and if you know what the word paleo means, it just means old. And so this is the old cortex compared to the other regions, which are generally larger, called the neocortex. Neo just means new. And so in the neocortex is where you see most of the the sensory processing regions, and also the parts of the cortex that directly control the muscles, called the motor cortex. And this region, pretty much by definition, is only found in mammals. So you can kind of see, even in the rat brain, this whole area, all of this here, is all neocortex, and it takes up the vast majority of the cerebrum. And that's true in humans too. So in a human brain, for example, most of this area here is neocortex in the human brain. And so generally it's what you can kind of see from the outside. Whereas if you look at, say, alligator brain, you can see the cortex overall takes up a much smaller proportion of brain volume. And most of that, again, is what we would call paleocortex. And other parts of the brain take over the sensory and motor functions. Now, the cerebral cortex, especially in humans, is so large that we divide it up into lobes. And we name those lobes after actually the parts of the skull they fit underneath. So here's a picture of the skull. And so this piece of bone right behind your forehead, or that makes up your forehead, we call the frontal bone. So the part of the brain behind that, behind your forehead, we call the frontal lobe. And then the parietal bone is really the bone that's kind of sits on top of your skull. And so the part of the brain underneath that we call the parietal lobe. And then the very, very back of your skull is made of a piece of bone called the occipital bone. And so we call the region of brain underneath that the occipital lobe. And then finally, there's the two sides of your skull made up of the temporal bones. And these are, you can remember that these are called the temporal bones because they're next to your temples. And so remember, your temples are kind of the sides of your head. So we call the sides of the brain the temporal lobe. So like I said, these are named after the parts of the skull, but they actually have functional differences and structural differences also. So the frontal lobe, for example, is divided from the parietal lobe by this groove that goes down the middle called the central sulcus. And in fact, all of these little grooves are called sulci. And the bumps on the surface are called gyri. So for example, this one right here is called the post-central gyrus. And it's called that because it is just posterior to the central sulcus. And so that's just an example, but we'll come back and talk about it more later. These other regions, there's a big groove between the temporal lobe and the parietal and frontal lobes called the Sylvian fissure, and that is what defines the top of the temporal lobe. In fact, the temporal lobe actually is really just, especially in humans, is really distinct from the other lobes. So what happened basically with human evolution, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, the reason the cerebral cortex is so large is because it's involved in a lot of the sort of higher level cognitive processes that we sort of think of as being uniquely human features. But to fit all that tissue inside the skull, the cortex had to kind of fold up and curl up. So that's where those gyri and sulci come from. And it's also why the temporal lobe is kind of tucked underneath the other lobe. So basically the brain grows sort of posteriorly as the cerebral cortex grows. And in order to fit, it just sort of curls up under itself. And of course, there's a temporal lobe on each side. The other three, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe, are all medial, meaning they're close to the middle. But there's also a medial surface. So you can't really see in this view, but if you look at the top view, you can see, or you can kind of tell that, or actually this is a better view up here. So here we're looking at the medial surface of the brain. And so, for example, this roughly would be the medial frontal lobe. This would be roughly the medial parietal lobe. And then you have medial occipital lobe back here. But there's not, there is a medial temporal lobe, but again, it doesn't actually touch the midline. So that's why you can't see the temporal lobes in a sagittal view, a sagittal section like this. Now, I already mentioned the different gyri and sulci. So the central sulcus is probably the one that you'll want to be able to recognize because, again, it divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then the post-central gyrus is just posterior to the central sulcus. And there's also a pre-central gyrus, which is anterior to the central sulcus. Again, I already mentioned the sylvian, sometimes called the lateral fissure, which divides the temporal lobe from the other lobes. Most of these gyri and sulci have names. Some of them we'll encounter as we go along. Most we won't, so we don't need to worry about them too much. But most of them are named after where they are. So, for example, this one here in pink is called the superior temporal gyrus because it's obviously part of the temporal lobe, and it's on the superior side of the temporal lobe. So again, remember this direction is superior, and this direction is inferior. So up here we'd have the superior temporal gyrus, and there's also an inferior temporal gyrus as well. So most of these gyrus have. Now, one thing to remember, or one thing to point out, is that whenever you see these diagrams or drawings, this is sort of an idealized brain. So if you were to actually put two human brains next to each other, the exact location of these landmarks and their size may differ slightly. So everyone kind of has a slightly unique shape to their brain, but you can usually find most of these major landmarks if you know what you're looking for. Another way of kind of mapping the cerebral cortex are these Brodmann's areas. So Brodmann was a neuroanatomist, and he basically looked at the cerebral cortex with mostly Nissl staining, which means we remember that that's a stain that labels the cell bodies and the dendrites of neurons, but it's a useful way to analyze, again, what we call the cytoarchitecture. Because like I said, the cerebral cortex has unique cytoarchitecture in that it's organized in a layered structure. But if you compare different parts of cortex to each other, you find that the exact thickness of those layers and the types of neurons from one region to the next vary slightly. So Brodmann went through the entire human brain and actually did this for other primate brains also, and found that there are at least 46 different areas that you can define by cytoarchitecture. And he just gave them numbers. So, for example, area 1 happens to correspond to this strip that's on that post-central gyrus. And then 2 and 3 are right next to that. 4 is anterior to the central sulcus. And then area 5 is back here posterior, and then he just went through and numbered them all. So whenever you see those numbers, and we don't have to memorize them because we're going to encounter some of these later on and we'll talk about them in more detail. But whenever you see a region of cortex referred to as, say, area 17 or area 6, that's what they mean. It's just these Brodmann's regions. And then some of these Brodmann's areas and some of these physical landmarks too actually correspond to different functional regions. So especially in that region that we call the neocortex, like I said, its main job has to do with sensory and motor functions. And in the human brain, these regions are clearly delineated from each other. But in non-human brains, they kind of overlap more, mostly, again, because the cerebral cortex in other animals is just much smaller. So if you look in a rat brain, for example, you can see this is the region devoted to processing visual information. And then ventral to that, you have the region dedicated to processing sound, or the auditory cortex. And then this region here in green is called sensory motor because it includes both sensory, somatosensory regions, which means mostly your sense of touch, and then the motor control, also the parts of the brain that control the muscles. In, say, the cat, the regions are still kind of spread out and take up a relatively large area in the cortex, but you can kind of see there's lots more sort of real estate in the cat cerebral cortex that is not colored here, which means that those regions do something else other than either processing visual input or auditory input or sensory motor. And then the human brain, you can see the primary areas devoted to just auditory input and visual input. So these two regions are the parts that get direct input from other parts of the brain that process visual and auditory input respectively. And we'll come back to these later. But they're very, very small. And then you can see also the somatic sensory, again, that's your sense of touch. And then the motor systems are separate. but each one appears to cover a pretty small region of the cerebral cortex compared to the rat or the cat, which might make you think that the human brain has less sensory and motor processing than those animals, but that's not true. It's just that those regions take up a much smaller proportion. In fact, remember that these are all not drawn to scale. So the rat brain is much, much smaller than the human brain. So the total area dedicated to, say, visual processing in the human brain is actually much bigger than that in the rat brain. In fact, you can fit the entire rat brain just into the visual region of a human brain. And so, but it does mean that there's all this space in between, these regions in between the sensory areas and in the frontal cortex especially, that are available for kind of higher level processing and especially what we call association regions. So these are regions between the, say, visual and auditory regions, or between the visual and somatic sensory regions, that are especially important for, again, sort of making associating different sensory stimuli with each other, which is useful for kind of combining and unifying your sensory systems. And we'll talk about those in more detail later on. All right, so next time we will talk about the major anatomical regions of the spinal cord and some of the other parts of the nervous system that are not the brain.